All right, welcome back. So we're going to move on from high level, talking about what APIs are, how they work, and how they are structured and what they respond with, JSON, XML. We're going to move on from that to actually getting dirty with APIs, actually working with them, incorporating them into an application. Before we do that, I'm going to do a quick refresher on how you can make HTTP requests. So the most common way that you've seen probably your whole life on the web is just using the browser. So I can open up a window and go to google.com. I made a request. I hit enter. I click this button. That makes me a request. If I do a search for dog, that's a request. I click on the dog link to Wikipedia, and that's a request. Okay, so that's one way. But I can also make requests through code, which is what we're going to learn about here is how do I write JavaScript that will make a request for me? How do I write JavaScript that will fetch JSON from the Yahoo Weather API or from the Reddit API? That's our whole goal here is to write some code that will go and get information from an API through a request and then do something with it, like save it to a database or show it to a user. And the secret to that is that you don't have to make a request through the browser. You can make a request through code. We're going to see how to do it using a package called request, oddly enough. But there's also other ways of doing it. A tool called curl, C-U-R-L, is a way to make requests from the command line. So not necessarily for an application, but just to show you that requests are independent of browsers. I can request http://www.google.com from my terminal. And I get this content, the exact same response that I do when I go to google.com. The key difference, of course, is that in a browser, that information is then rendered back to me, so I see this. But the underlying text, the HTML that's sent back, is what I'm seeing here. So most of the time in our code, we're not going to be asking for HTML from a web page. I mean, this is such a mess to work with. Instead, we're usually asking for JSON or XML from an API. But the same idea holds true. I can request an API using curl. So I just do curl and then an API URL. But that's not what we're going to do really for most applications. That's just a kind of an educational demonstration that you can do it from the command line. We're going to do it inside of an application. And we're going to start really, really simple. I'm going to show you how you make a request in Node. So I'm going to make a new directory here, APIs, and then I'm going to make a new file. I'm just going to call it first request.js. So all we're going to do is make a request from a JavaScript file. So we'll just request google.com again, which is what we just did using curl. And I know it's can be a lot to take in. The whole point is just we made a request in the browser by refreshing the page. We made a request in the command line. It works the same way as far as the content we get back. Now let's do the same thing, but from a JavaScript file. So I'm going to open up that file, and we want to put our code here that will make the request. So how do we do that? How do we make a request from Node? There's a lot of different libraries, packages you can use. The one we're going to use is called request, and this is probably the most common. So github.com/request will get you there, or just Google Node request. Simplified HTTP request client. So this is how we can make a simple request. This is kind of the basic syntax. If you take a look, we first include it by requiring request, setting it to a variable, just like every other package. Then what we do is make a request to a URL, and then we have a function that we pass it. And there's multiple parts to this function, or multiple arguments: an error, response, and body. And so we use a callback here because making a request takes time. Sometimes it'll be very fast, a matter of milliseconds. Sometimes the request, if you're requesting a web page that doesn't exist or a server that's down, it will get hung up. And so you need to wait oftentimes to do anything until you have a response, whether it's good or bad. So we'll see, and we'll talk about what these are and how you use them. for now, let's just copy this over. And I'm actually going to retype it line by line, but I'm just going to keep it here so you can see it. And the very first thing we need to do, of course, is install the package request. So npm install request. And that should go get us request. And then we'll be able to require it correctly up here. Okay, so we've done that. I'm going to just resize a little bit here. And I'm just going to rewrite this so we can go over it. Require request. Nice and simple to start. So the next line is actually making that request. So this app, if you want to call it an app, whenever we run it, we'll just run node first request.js. All it will do is print out the HTML from Google. That'll be the first thing we do. So if our request is equals require request, then we make our request. So we'll do http://www.google.com. Exactly what we did with curl, the same URL, and we expect the same HTML. So that's the first part. That will make the request. But to do anything with the information that comes back, we need a callback. And as I explained, that's because it's not instantaneous. It takes time. This request has to go all the way to a server somewhere, potentially thousands of miles away, then come all the way back to us, and then our computer has to understand it and make sense of it. So there are three things that we pass in: error, response, and body. The first one, which is error, will hold any potential error that we get. So if there's a problem, the server is down, or the request times out, or we don't have an internet connection, for instance. If I turn my Wi-Fi off and try that, we'll get an error back. So we'll see how to play with that in a little bit, but it's important that you check for an error. So we'll do something like this. If there's an error, and then we'll have an else. So if there's an error, let's just console.log, whoops, something went wrong. And then we'll also console.log the error itself. Otherwise, that means that we got something back. You can see there's a second thing that they're checking for here in this example. If response.status code is 200. So we're not going to go into status codes all that much, but you probably are familiar with 404 status code whenever you try and request a page that doesn't exist anymore. If we look up 404 status code, the not found error message that you see, if you're trying to request something that can't be found. There are a lot of other status codes though, as you can see here. The most important one though is 200. It stands for OK. It's a standard response for successful requests. So if things went well and we got a response, we want to check if its status code is 200, because we could potentially get a response that has a status code of something else other than 200, like the page has moved. And that's not going to be 200, and we want to handle that differently. So this is something you can kind of just not hard code, but you can always assume, is that you want to check if the status code is 200. So we'll do that in here for now as a nested if statement. So if response.status code equals 200. So if we get here, things worked. Okay, so if that happened, let's just do a console.log, and we're going to print out body. So that's the last piece of information, which is the actual response body, the stuff that came back. That will be our text, that'll be our HTML from Google. So there's a lot to take in. I'm going to get rid of this for now, just comment that all out, save my file, and let's see what happens. So node first request.js, that's the name of our file. And wow, we get all the HTML printed out. Great. So let's also try changing that URL. Let's go to reddit.com. Save the file, run it, and here's our Reddit HTML. We could do the exact same thing with an API. So if we go back to the Yahoo weather endpoint, This is to get the sunset time for Hawaii. I'm not expecting you to type this or follow this exactly. But if I paste that URL here, this giant URL, this is the API for Yahoo Weather that will give me sunset time. Let's see if it worked. And it did. We have that information back. Awesome. So I'm actually going to get rid of that for a second. Now let's take a look at if I change some things. So what if I request http://www.google and a bunch of random stuff.com, and I save the file and I make a request. I get something went wrong. So that means we got an error. And on top of that, the error itself has some information from console.log error. The error is not found. So our page wasn't found. So that's the use of the checking for the error, is you can make sure that the request worked. So if we didn't, and we just automatically handled it, and in this case, all we're doing is printing the body. But let's say we're saving data to the database. We want to make sure that we got the data first and that the request worked and we didn't make it to the wrong place or that, something went wrong. But we can simplify this all. As you can see up here, this is a nice shortened version where you just have one if statement, checks for both of those at the same time. All right, so that's how we make a request from Node using this request library or request package. Very simple in the sense that it's pretty much always going to be the same. You're just going to require request, and then you're going to add the URL in that you request. And we'll change this back to just google.com. Then you have your callback function, 3 pieces of information, check for an error, check for the status code and the response, and then do something with the body. Usually we don't just print it out, but this is where we would do something with it, is if there's no error and status code is 200. So I know it's a lot, but it's kind of a recipe you can follow. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to explore a little bit more with APIs and actually request a JSON API and do something with it.